Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for the fireside chat with Amy Remeikis, political reporter for The Guardian and author of the recent essay on reckoning published by Hachette for On Series. I'm Danielle Asciak, CEO of the Women's Club. I'm joining from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are meeting and pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples on this call today. I'd also like to acknowledge the First Nations women who have been excluded, forgotten, and deliberately overlooked in the decisions and movements that we will talk about today. Amy, welcome to the Virtual Women's Club. Thank you for giving us half hour of your time and sharing your thoughts and story with us today, especially with a young baby and everything that's going on in the world. I haven't given a large introduction or biography because I thought I'd ask you, who is Amy Remeikis?
As we were just chatting a few minutes ago, Amy Remeikis is a work in progress, as I think most of us are. I mean, from a biography point of view, I have been a journalist for, goodness, about 15 years or so. I started in radio, went into television, but found that I'm more comfortable with the written word. I think it's because I tend to say things the long way rather than the short way, which you can't really do in broadcast. Plus, I have really thick hair that I'm not going to be able to control for anyone. And as one news director once put it, too much face. So being mostly behind the scenes kind of suits me. As a human being, though, I am the child of a Lithuanian refugee who was raised very much in the Eastern European culture by my grandmother and my father, who just that's all they managed to take with them, really, when they fled Lithuania. I watched as my father became one of those migrant stories that you sometimes hear about, where they assimilate so much they actually kind of go full circle. So I saw my father become quite conservative and right wing as I was growing up, which sort of helped shaped me in terms of my politics and how I view the world, because I couldn't understand somebody who had come to this country illegally, with no papers, essentially turning on others who were fleeing the same circumstances. So it was a bit of a strange upbringing. I'm also a rape survivor and have spoken about that in recent years. And other than that, I'm just your average sort of millennial mess.
I guess with that background, I would say has shaped your politics, what you stand for in some ways. And is that what prompted you to enter journalism and I guess political reporting in particular?
Yeah, absolutely. I was watching just that really strange dichotomy with my father and talking to my grandmother, who would talk to me about what the Soviets did and why they had to flee Lithuania. And I mean, she lost 3 children, while she fled. She never saw 3 of her 4 children again. And they were so grateful that Australia had, accepted them. But my father just took it to the nth degree, where he was going to be more Australian than Australians. And I remember just thinking as a kid, like, it just didn't make sense. And it really installed in me a big sense of fairness, I suppose, because I was watching my dad sort of turn his back on his culture and what he had to do to get here in order to assimilate with Australian society, and then start to lose some compassion for other migrants and refugees. And I think that for Tete, it was because he felt like he had to give everything up to become Australian, and he didn't understand new generations of migrants and refugees who didn't have to give everything up, or at least in his view. So that is one of the big reasons why I became a journalist, was just because I was just really interested in human nature and people's stories and what led them to being the people that they were. But also, I do have to give my father credit, because because one of the big things he did instill in all of us was just how important understanding the world is. And we obviously have very different worldviews, my father and I, but it was really important that we did understand more than just our world, that we needed to like understand what was happening outside of Australia or outside of where I grew up in South Australia and Queensland. And so that was another reason why I became a journalist. And since then, all my father and I do is argue about politics, which I think has managed to keep him alive through several strokes.
Yeah, okay. Well, thanks for sharing that. And, talking about stories, this is where we get to On Reckoning, because it is, as Julia Baird says on the cover of your book, and it's a little pocket-sized book, 102 pages long. She says that it's visceral, forensic, fierce. This book is a lit fuse. Now, I agree with her because I read this on a bus ride to work. I'm from, I travel from Camperdown into the city. I read it. It was the first 2 pages are electric. For those that haven't read it, I would say, it is a pretty fast read, but it is quite palpable, the energy. And strangely, it reminded me of poetry, specifically something from the Beat Generation, because the start of it is really short and sharp. I can taste your rage. So let's talk about On Reckoning. What brought you to this place? Can you describe that moment for us?
Rage brought me to this place, and I can still feel it talking to you every time I think about it, or I look at the essay. I can feel it in the pit of my core, essentially. And I think for a lot of people, rage lives within them and they just don't know what to do with it. And it can be one act, or it can be, several acts that just keep hitting you and hitting you and hitting you. And you don't know what's going to be the one that tips you over. I liken it to sort of a cup, and each act against you is like a drip of water, and you never know what drip is going to overflow your cup. But for me, it was hearing the Prime Minister explain that he had to have the allegations of a rape that happened just down from his office explained to him in the context of what he would like, what action he would like taken if it was his daughters, and that his wife had to put that into context for him. And I heard that, and I kind of lost it. I actually did let out a howl at that, because my day job when Parliament sits is to run the Guardian Politics Live blog. So I do a blow-by-blow coverage of the parliamentary day, and that covers all of politics. And so I am ridiculously plugged in during that time. I'm posting something every couple of minutes that's happened. I've got multiple screens. I'm in contact with multiple people, finding out what's going on. I'm watching all of the press conferences, and then I'm relaying those press conferences to the blog and for our readers. So I was still doing my job, but I was on autopilot. I was just copying and pasting the transcription of his press conference where he said this. But I kind of disassociated from myself because of just how flabbergasted I was that the leader of the country did not understand something that impacts so many people, just so many people, like men and women and children and all of the genders, all of the vulnerable people. And I just couldn't understand how he was like, oh, I get it now. My wife explained it to me to think of my daughters. And when I was rescued from a sexual assault attempt, the couple who rescued me had originally driven past. They thought it was a domestic, they told me later, even though I was on the ground on the side of the road fighting for what I thought was my life against a man who was on top of me and clawing and just awful, awful things. They originally drove past, but they turned back because one of them said to the other, what if it was our daughter? And they told me this as they were taking me to the police station. And I was so grateful to them for rescuing me. But at the same time, I remember thinking, you had to think of your daughter. You saw someone who was obviously in trouble and you stopped because you thought of your daughter. Like, why do we always have to wear somebody else's face? And one of the main issues I have with that selected empathy is that I look like the daughters of a lot of people in power. I'm white, so therefore I'm familiar to them. If they have to think of their daughter before thinking about, you know, how a white woman would feel when she raised these allegations, then how on earth are they ever going to hear the cries of anyone who's not white, who doesn't look like me? And that's my issue with selected empathy, because I understand that people go, well, why wouldn't we think of our loved ones? But if you have to think of your loved ones, then you're cutting out so many people who need your attention and need you to focus on what is happening, because it's happening to more than just white women. And that's not really a conversation that we've been having.
Yes. And on 78 to 82 of your essay, you do write a few phrases that says, we require people to perform their trauma. We require a human sacrifice and pain in order to be taken seriously. And we require someone to look at it in order to feel an emotional connection and empathy. And that's what you've just described. And there's so much to unpack in that chapter of the essay, including role modeling of other women in leadership, women as sacrifice, but also the power of sharing our stories. So let's start with the latter. Through sharing, I feel that women realize that they are not alone in this. It's really important that we share, because it's not just about sexual assault, but it's all the things that we've been told that is shameful: miscarriage, abortion, intimacies, our bodies. And I think more and more I've started just opening up that conversation with friends and realize, oh, wow, you went through this? I've gone through this. Where were you? Oh my goodness. And it really starts. And I've had one woman say, why are you telling me this? We've just met. And I said, because this is part of my story. And in order for me to heal and get through it, I want to be able to connect with you and share this part. But I also know that it is really damaging to us to keep recounting those stories. And you have been doing it. And also Grace Tame and Brittany Higgins, they've been doing it, and they're in the spotlight doing it. So how do you keep recounting your story, and how does one protect themselves from the dangers of the re-traumatization?
I can only speak for myself and my own experience, but I don't think you can protect yourself from re-traumatizing yourself. It is something that lives within me, and each time I talk about it, I go back there. And I think that's because when you have been broken down by a trauma, by a violation like that, and you have to rebuild yourself, you put the pieces back together, but you're putting pieces of what happened back together with you. And so it's never far away. And in the essay, and when speaking to friends, I liken it to an invisible cloak that's kind of always with you, and you never know when it's going to tighten around you. I mean, it might be talking about it. It might be hearing somebody else's story. It might be a smell or a date or a phrase. For me, if I smell rum, I can go straight back to when I was raped. Or if a friend or a partner just, like comes up from behind me and hugs me, I can completely freak out and go a little bit catatonic. And so talking about it does take me there, and it can stay with me. But I feel, for me, I have a platform, and that is a huge privilege, and I want to do good with it. And there are so many people who can't speak about this for reasons that are entirely their own. And you're no less brave for not speaking. Like, we need to get that absolutely clear. You do not have to be, you do not have to tell your story, share your trauma in order to be courageous, because just getting out of bed is a courageous act.
Courageous act, yeah.
So, like, you do not have to share your story. We still see you and we still hear you. But I see part of my role within the Australian media of bringing experience to my job. Because experience matters, particularly when you're covering politics, because so much of politics does impact real life. And if you don't actually understand how it impacts real life, you can't do your job properly. You can't actually explain why these policies are bad, or why the Prime Minister talking about how his wife explained it to him in terms of his daughter, or why hearing the Defence Minister call it he said, she said, or why hearing, Linda Reynolds referring to somebody who's made very serious and heartbreaking allegations about her time in that office, refer to her as a silly cow. Like, why these are huge deals and need to be taken seriously. So I see that as the price that I have to pay in order to make sure that we do keep talking about this, and that I can also provide space for others to talk about it as well.
Thank you. You've mentioned Linda Reynolds. I guess we go back to the role modeling of women in leadership when they stand in the shadows, when they don't speak up or stand for women, the sisterhood that we all talk about. What can these women do more of, or what are they not doing, and how can we have them realize just as much as the men in leadership?
I know the Madeleine Albright, quote about there's a special place in hell for women who don't support other women. And I don't necessarily agree with that, because I don't think that feminism, at least for me, is agreeing with all other women at all times. I think that's kind of a bit of a girl boss view of feminism that can be quite toxic, because you can see a lot of women deploy that when you call them out for, frankly, shit behavior. Like, oh, you're going against the sisterhood, nice feminism. And I saw that during the really intense 6 months following Brittany Higgins making those allegations, because you would see MPs come out to talk about how they had never seen this sort of behavior themselves. So you had women coming forward talking about harassment, abuse, bullying. You had a lot of anonymous women come forward who were staffers talking about what had happened to them while working for political parties, enough so that when Kate Jenkins did her report into parliamentary culture, she found like more than half of the people working in the parliament had been subjected to abuse, harassment, or assault. It's frankly unbelievable when you look at it in sheer numbers, that there are so many people going to work in what's supposed to be the most protected building in the country and being like vilified and traumatized, harassed and abused and assaulted. Like, that's just insane. But yet you would see all of these predominantly female politicians come forward and say, that's never been my experience. Well, that's great. If you've been the unicorn who's managed to forge a political career as a woman, where you have not ever been put down for being a woman, you haven't been, abused or harassed or talked down to or any of it, fantastic for you. But shut up, because you're actually undermining and devaluing the people who are speaking up about what's happening to them. Because every single time you hear somebody say, that's never happened to me, all you're saying is like, well, I don't see this as being a problem. And that is a big issue for me, because if it's not a problem for you, that's great, but it doesn't mean that it's not a problem for other people. Yeah. And upholding, the line or the power structures that allow those problems to continue is a form, I think, of abuse, really. And this is not a gendered thing, although I know people see it as gendered, but I've always called them crumb maidens. They're people who uphold power structures because of the residual crumbs of power that they may receive in return. And we have seen quite a lot of examples over Australian political history of people who do that until suddenly the power structures turn on them too. And they're just like, oh no, wait, it is a problem. And then they begin speaking up about what's happened to them, but it's always once they've left politics. It's never once they're actually in the party. So that's what I think those people, particularly those women, can do. If they've never seen this, then great. Don't enter the conversation. This is not your space. This is not a place for you. We need to hear from the people who it's happened to about what they think needs to happen. We don't need to hear from someone who it hasn't happened to about what they think needs to happen, because it's a completely ridiculous point.
Now, we are getting to 20 past 5. This is a fireside chat for a pretty, as Julia says, a lit fuse. We're getting through this pretty quickly. There is a Q&A feature, so I will leave some time for some questions from our viewers, our attendees on the call. Now, there was one thing there was a few more questions that I have. Gosh, we needed more time. But it is something that came up on my feed from Women's Agenda a week ago. Susan Redden-Makatoa reported on the Edelman's Trust Barometer, and they found that media 52% and government 55% are seen as dividing forces in society. And now we're coming up to an election. I think it's going to get a little bit worse, and divisiveness is working for them, but at a cost. And this is verbatim from this article in Women's Agenda. She says, in the public arena, we're playing the person, not the policy, and it's distracting us from the issues at hand. It comes at a personal price and it's exhausting, as we've heard firsthand from Amy. So while I'm curious to know what was running in your mind recently on the project, what steps do we need to take to stop the targeting, the takedowns, and move to facts and issues, especially at this time leading up to an election?
I think sharing the load definitely helps. And by that, I don't mean people coming forward and talking about their trauma, because we frankly, women have done enough of that, I think, to try and get people to listen. I think we need to see a lot of the men actually step up and not tell us what the solutions are, but actually start to play a very active role in what, frankly, I believe is a men's issue. I don't believe gendered violence is a women's issue, because it's not just one man running around sexually assaulting or raping all of the people that we know have been sexually assaulted or raped in Australia. It's not just one man doing that. As much as we like to think that everyone we know is a good bloke, somebody's good bloke can be somebody else's monster. And we don't seem to ever talk about that side of the conversation. So I think sharing the load is definitely something that needs to happen. And that was part of the reason part of what was running through my head during that project appearance. It wasn't something I had planned or even thought about doing before I opened my mouth. I only found out that Peter Van Onselen was going to be a panelist on a couple of moments before I went on air. And he had written that day about Grace Tame not smiling when she met the Prime Minister, and how it was childish and juvenile, and how if she was going to react like that, she should have just not turned up. And I just was really angry by that piece, because telling, women to smile or be polite is just another way of telling them to stay quiet and, to just sit in the corner and just wait until the very big, powerful people say it's time for them to come and join the table. But you can only join the table if you're the right sort of woman, and you're going to be nice and polite and have a rational conversation and not be emotional over what is a very emotional issue. I don't know how much more emotional it gets than talking about violence and rape and assault. So that made me very angry. And then when I saw that he was going to be one of the people asking me questions about my essay, I just was like, I'm going to be the world's biggest hypocrite if I don't actually say something here, because frankly, how dare he, the audacity to have written a column basically saying be polite or exit the room, and then to be all like, oh, let's talk about your essay, which is on this very topic. I just yeah. So that was what was going through my mind, and that's why I think men do need to share the load a lot, and they need to start talking about solutions. And I don't mean within the women's space, but I just mean what they are actually doing to address this, because this isn't something government can fix, regardless of who is in government, because this is something that is ingrained in society, and it's something that is impacting people outside of Parliament. And, you can have as many politicians as you want stand up and say all the right words, but it doesn't necessarily translate to, women being safe or protected spaces. So we actually need that, that shift within society, that cultural shift, before we're going to start seeing any change. And we need to stop telling women how to be safe, and we need to start talking to the men about how to honour consent. that's frankly it. I mean, we talk to women about how to be safe, how to walk with your keys in your hands, talk on the phone to your friends, don't go out at night. If you're going to exercise at night, then you need to do it in a well-lit space. Tell someone where you're going. We have all of these rules for women when they go out. I mean, a couple of years ago, I was shoe shopping and there were these two young women in their early 20s trying on a pair of boots. And she turned to her friend and went, "These are great, and I could run in these if I had to." And it was just such a natural conversation for her. And her friend was like, "Oh, that's great." And I just thought, we have to think about this. Can I run in my shoes if I have to? But what are we telling our men? Are we telling them how to honor consent? Are we telling them to pull up a mate if he's starting to abuse a woman, or if they're at a party or a pub and they see somebody begin to take advantage of someone who is too intoxicated for consent? Do we pull them up on that? Do we pull up men on the jokes that they make? Do we pull up men when they start to target and harass like other women? Do we pull them up then? Do we stop it at the start? Or are we relying on women to protect themselves? Because every time we say that to a woman, we're saying that you share the responsibility for what happened to you. And that is not the case. The only thing a woman has ever done when she finds when she's raped or assaulted, the only thing she's ever done is find herself in a room with an assaulter or a rapist. That's it. She did not make that choice. Somebody has made that choice for her. And we never talk about the person who made the choice.
And there was another question that I wanted to lead on from that I think as we're getting to 5:26, I'm going to answer or ask the question on behalf of Clara. What do you think needs to be done to focus on the stories of women of colour? Do white women need to do more to help raise these women's stories up? Or is it also part of a reflection of who has their voices heard or who has a platform, as well as potential cultural issues?
It's difficult for me to answer because obviously I'm not a woman of color and I am a white woman who is taking up space in this conversation and, you know, who has a platform. The way that I try to walk the walk is by suggesting women of color in place of myself in panels or on television or, you know, podcasts or whatever, is basically to say, have you spoken to, you know, and name somebody I know who has been raising advocacy on that issue or knows of people who have been speaking on the issue for a very long time. And if I'm doing a podcast, I will do my best to make sure that, you know, that there is a person of color on the panel or on the podcast or whatever, where I have that power, or I will just say, hey, I don't think I'm the best person to speak to on this. You should speak to, you know, that other person. And I think that's more of us should be doing that. We should actually be clearing the space. And like, if the door has been opened for us, then we should be helping others through and often ahead of ourselves, because we know how much space we take up in the media. And so we really need to start sharing that space, because if there's one thing that the last year has shown, it's the importance of diversity in the press gallery, at least, in terms of like how Brittany Higgins told her story, and a whole heap of women stood up and made sure that Brittany Higgins' voice was heard and that other women's voices were heard in predominantly what has been a space dominated by middle-aged white men. We saw that change for that particular issue. So that's the importance of gender diversity. But then we also really need to start hearing from people who don't look like me, because we know that First Nations women have been screaming about this for decades. Women of color, that, you know, women from other religions other than Christianity have been talking about this for decades and raising the alarm, and yet they're still excluded from government panels and, you know, government conferences and just speaking on it, you know, within mainstream media. So if you've got a platform, just shuffle a bit to the side and give some room to someone else.
Thanks, Amy. There's one other question which we'll end on, and that is from Rebecca Davies. What can we do as voters in the current election campaign to keep these issues at the fore?
Well, ask about them with your candidates, but also vote according to where your conscience lies on them, because you know what you're going to get from certain political parties. And if that doesn't fit with your value system, and this is an important issue to you, then that's the issue that you need to vote on. Because so often we try to make political parties be all things to all people, and they're not. So pick what your core issue is, pick what your value is that is important to you and what you want to see reflected in the parliament, and vote on that.
Great. And will you continue to report on politics coming up?
Yes, no, I will be still reporting on politics coming up. Unfortunately, that I don't have many skills. So basically, talking shit about politics is one of the only skills that I have. So yeah, I will be continuing to do that.
So we're going to be following you through that journey. I guess I want to finish on a final. What's the key takeaway from On Reckoning?
That rage can be healthy and righteous and good, and you don't have to not show your anger. Like, you don't have to go out and beat up the first man that you see, but you don't have to be quiet, you don't have to be polite, you don't have to think about this or speak about it in an unemotional, rational way. Your anger and your rage is reasonable, and the reactions that you have to that anger is reasonable, and don't let anyone tell you differently.
Great way to finish this. Thank you so much, Amy, for the conversation. And we hope to have you in the physical club soon. And thanks to everyone who's joined us this afternoon for that quick half an hour to finish up your work day, or just a day. We've recorded this conversation for your playback. And I just wanted to finish with kind of the follow-up on next week. So we are hosting a hybrid International Women's Day lunch on Tuesday, 8th of March, with humanitarian capitalist Kat Dunn, as well as a panel of members, including our Vice President, Angela Kwan, Human Resources Specialist, Zaina Altaf, and one of our longest service members, first female racehorse trainer, Betty Lane Holland. The theme is Break the Bias, and I think we're going to be carrying on the issues of this conversation with Amy today into that conversation. And then on Thursday, 10th of March, Byron Fay, Executive Director of Climate 200, will address the club on gender priorities for candidates. And if you'd like to keep up to date with our events, please join our mailing list, visit our website, follow Amy. And thanks again, Amy.
Thank you for having me.
And
if this has brought up anything for anyone, I'm truly sorry. I know the price that it can pay. So please, check in with your support networks.
Thank you. And everyone at home, thank you. Have a good night.